The morning bell rang at 5 o'clock, just like it had for the past 67 years. Sister Margaret opened her eyes in the small, simple room that had been her home for nearly 7 decades. The walls were bare except for a wooden cross and a faded photograph of her parents. At 86 years old, her movements were slower now, but her spirit remained strong. She dressed quietly in her traditional habit, the same style she had worn since she was 19. The fabric was worn soft from years of washing, and the rosary, beads at her waist, clicked gently as she walked. This was her routine. Wake up, pray, dress, and begin another day of service to God and her community. The convent hallways were quiet in the early morning. Sister Margaret's footsteps echoed softly on the old wooden floors as she made her way to the chapel for morning prayers. She passed the same doors, the same windows, the same peaceful spaces she had walked past thousands of times before. This was her world, and she found comfort in its unchanging rhythm. After prayers, she headed to the kitchen to help prepare breakfast. The other sisters greeted her with warm smiles and gentle nods. They all knew Sister Margaret as the quiet one, the one who worked hard but never complained, the one who had wisdom in her eyes but kept her thoughts to herself. She was respected and loved by everyone in the convent, though few knew much about her life before she took her vows. The kitchen was filled with the smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee. Sister Margaret rolled up her sleeves and began cutting vegetables for the morning meal. Her hands moved with practiced skill, weathered from years of gardening, cooking, and caring for others. These same hands had written countless letters to worried families, had comforted crying children, and had planted hundreds of flowers in the convent garden. But there was something special about these hands that nobody in the convent knew. Something that had been hidden for so long that sometimes even Sister Margaret herself almost forgot about it. As she worked in the kitchen, her mind wandered to the past, as it sometimes did in quiet moments. She remembered being a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sitting on a piano bench next to her mother. Her mother's gentle voice would guide her through scales and simple melodies. "Feel the music, my dear," her mother would say. "Don't just play the notes. Let the music flow through your heart." Those were happy memories, but they felt like they belonged to someone else now. That little girl who loved music seemed so far away from the woman she had become. After breakfast, Sister Margaret walked through the convent gardens. This was one of her favorite times of the day. She had spent decades tending to these flowers and vegetables, watching them grow and bloom with the changing seasons. The garden was her sanctuary, a place where she could think and pray while working with her hands. The roses were blooming beautifully this time of year, their sweet fragrance filling the air. She bent down to examine a particularly lovely pink rose, checking for pests and making sure it had enough water. Gardening had taught her patience and faith. You plant seeds, you water them, you care for them, and eventually, with God's blessing, something beautiful grows. As she worked, she could hear sounds from inside the convent. The younger sisters were teaching children in the small school they ran. She could hear laughter and voices, the sound of young minds learning and growing. It made her smile. She had spent many years teaching too, helping children learn to read and write, sharing stories and wisdom. But there was one sound that always made her pause when she heard it. It came from the common room where the old upright piano sat. Sometimes one of the sisters would play simple hymns during community gatherings. The sound would drift through the windows and reach her in the garden, and something inside her would stir. The piano had been in the convent for as long as she could remember. It was old and slightly out of tune, with keys that stuck sometimes, and a bench that wobbled if you sat too far to one side. Most of the sisters could play basic songs, nothing fancy, just simple melodies to accompany their singing during celebrations or quiet evening gatherings. Sister Margaret had walked past that piano thousands of times. She had dusted it, polished it, and even helped move it once when they rearranged the furniture in the common room. But she had never touched the keys. Not once in 67 years. Sometimes late at night when she couldn't sleep, she would walk through the quiet halls of the convent. Her footsteps would naturally lead her to the common room, where the piano sat in the corner like a faithful, old friend. She would stand there in the darkness, looking at the instrument that had once been such a huge part of her life. The piano keys looked like teeth in the moonlight that came through the windows. She would remember how those keys used to feel under her fingers, smooth and responsive, each one with its own personality and voice. She would remember the music that used to flow from her hands, melodies that could make people cry or laugh or feel things they couldn't put into words. But those were memories from another life, from the person she used to be before she gave her life to God. When she took her vows at 19, she had promised to leave worldly things behind. Music, she had decided, was one of those worldly things. It was something that belonged to her old life, not her new one. The truth was, Sister Margaret had been more than just someone who could play piano. She had been exceptional. Before entering the convent, she had been accepted to study at one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. Her teachers had called her gifted, said she had a rare talent that came along once in a generation. They had predicted a brilliant career performing in concert halls around the world. But life had other plans. When she was 18, her parents died in an accident. Suddenly, the world seemed dark and meaningless. The music that had once brought her so much joy felt empty and pointless. She questioned everything: her dreams, her future, her purpose in life. It was during this dark time that she found comfort in faith. The local church became her refuge, and the kind priest there helped her find meaning in her suffering. Slowly, she began to feel called to a life of service. She wanted to help others the way she had been helped. She wanted to dedicate her life to something bigger than herself. So at 19, she entered the convent. She traded her dreams of concert halls for a life of prayer and service. She traded her beautiful dresses for simple habits. And she traded her music for silence. The other sisters in the convent had no idea about her past. As far as they knew, she was just another young woman who had felt called to religious life. She never spoke about her musical training or her lost dreams. She simply focused on her new life, her new purpose. Years passed, then decades. Sister Margaret threw herself into her work with complete dedication. She cared for the sick, taught children, tended gardens, and prayed countless hours. She found peace and purpose in her chosen life. The music became a distant memory, something that belonged to her youth. But the piano remained in the common room, a constant reminder of what she had given up. Every time she heard someone play it, even simple hymns, something deep inside her would respond. Her fingers would sometimes move slightly, as if remembering old patterns and melodies. Her heart would beat a little faster, and for just a moment, she would remember who she used to be. The old upright piano had become a symbol of her sacrifice, a reminder of the choice she had made long ago. It sat there quietly, waiting, as if it knew that someday, somehow, those talented hands would find their way back to its keys. But Sister Margaret was determined that day would never come. She had made her choice, and she would stick to it. Lisanam, music would remain buried, and the piano would remain silent under her touch. That was her promise to God, and she intended to keep it. Little did she know that life had other plans, and that sometimes the gifts we bury deepest are the ones that refuse to stay hidden forever. The day everything changed started like any other ordinary morning at the convent. Sister Margaret was in the garden watering the tomato plants when she heard the rumble of a car engine coming up the long gravel driveway. Visitors were rare at their peaceful convent, so she looked up with curiosity. A black sedan pulled up to the front entrance, and out stepped a tall, stern-looking woman carrying a leather briefcase. Sister Margaret didn't think much of it at the time. The convent occasionally received visits from church officials or benefactors. She went back to her gardening, humming softly to herself as she worked. The sun was warm on her back, and the flowers were blooming beautifully. It was one of those perfect mornings that made her grateful for the simple life she had chosen. But inside the convent, that visitor was about to turn their peaceful world upside down. The woman was Sister Catherine, and she had been appointed as their new Mother Superior. The previous Mother Superior, Sister Rose, had been with them for over 20 years. She was kind and gentle, understanding that the nuns were human beings with different personalities and small joys that made their devoted life bearable. Under Her leadership, the convent, had been a place of both spiritual devotion and quiet happiness. Sister Rose had passed away peacefully in her sleep just 2 months earlier, leaving the community grieving and uncertain about their future. They had all hoped that someone from within their own convent would be chosen to lead them, someone who understood their ways and cherished their traditions. Instead, they got Sister Catherine. Within the first week, it became clear that their new leader had very different ideas about how a convent should be run. Sister Catherine had come from a much stricter religious community, where silence was valued above almost everything else, and where any form of personal expression was viewed with suspicion. She called the first community meeting on a rainy Thursday evening. All the sisters gathered in the main hall, sitting in their usual spots on the wooden chairs arranged in a circle. Sister Margaret sat in the back as she always did, quietly folding her hands in her lap and waiting to hear what their new leader had to say. Sister Catherine stood at the front of the room, her back straight and her expression serious. She was younger than most of them, maybe in her 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. When she spoke, her voice was clear and firm, leaving no room for questions or discussion. "Sisters," she began, "I have been observing our community for the past week, and I have noticed several areas where we have become too relaxed in our devotion. A religious life requires sacrifice and discipline. We must remove all distractions that pull our hearts and minds away from God." The sisters exchanged worried glances. What did she mean by distractions? They didn't have to wait long to find out. "From now on," Sister Catherine continued, "there will be stricter rules about entertainment and worldly pleasures. I have noticed that some of you have been indulging in activities that serve no spiritual purpose. Music, for example, can lead to vanity and pride. These are emotions that have no place in a servant of God's heart." Sister Margaret felt her stomach drop. She looked around the room and saw similar expressions of concern on her sisters' faces. Music had always been a small but important part of their community life. They would gather around the old piano for evening songs, celebrating birthdays with cheerful melodies or comforting each other with gentle hymns during difficult times. The piano in the common room will only be used for basic hymns during official worship services, Sister Catherine announced. "No more casual playing, no more entertainment music, and certainly no more of what I witnessed yesterday, someone playing what sounded like worldly classical music." Sister Margaret's heart began to race. Just the day before, Sister Anna, one of the younger nuns, had been playing a beautiful piece by Bach on the piano. It wasn't exactly a hymn, but it was deeply spiritual and moving. Several sisters had gathered around to listen, finding peace and joy in the music. It had been a moment of pure, innocent happiness, but apparently that kind of happiness was now forbidden. "Music can be a pathway to showing off," Sister Catherine continued. "When we play complex pieces or try to impress others with our skills, we are feeding our ego instead of serving God. From now on, only simple, traditional hymns will be permitted, and only during scheduled worship times." The room was completely silent. Sister Margaret could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She thought about all the times over the years when she had walked past that piano, fighting the urge to touch its keys. She had already sacrificed her musical gifts once, when she entered the convent. But knowing that the music was still there, that she could hear others play, had been a small comfort. Now even that comfort was being taken away. Over the next few days, the impact of the new rules became clear. Sister Anna, who had brought so much joy to their community with her piano playing, looked sad and lost. She would sit in the common room, staring at the now silent piano with tears in her eyes. The younger sisters, who had been learning simple songs, were told to stop their lessons immediately. The atmosphere in the convent changed. Where there had once been occasional laughter and gentle music drifting through the halls, now there was only silence. Mealtimes became quieter. Evening gatherings became shorter and more formal. The joy seemed to be slowly draining out of their peaceful community. Sister Margaret watched it all with a heavy heart. She saw how the restriction was affecting the other sisters, especially the younger ones who had found such innocent pleasure in music. Sister Anna had been like a daughter to many of them, bringing lightness and beauty into their structured days. Now she moved through her duties like a shadow of her former self. One evening, Sister Margaret decided she had to do something. She had remained silent for too long while watching her sisters suffer. She made up her mind to speak with Sister Catherine privately, to try to reason with her about the music ban. She knocked on the Mother Superior's office door just after evening prayers. Sister Catherine's voice called out for her to enter. The office was different now. The warm, personal touches that Sister Rose had kept were gone, replaced by stark religious imagery and stacks of rule books. "Sister Margaret," Sister Catherine said without looking up from her paperwork. "What can I do for you?" Sister Margaret had practiced what she wanted to say, but now, standing in front of this intimidating woman, the words felt stuck in her throat. She took a deep breath and tried to speak calmly. "Mother Superior, I wanted to talk to you about the music restrictions," she began. "I've been watching the other sisters, especially the younger ones, and I can see how much they're struggling with this change. Music has always brought them closer to God, not further away." Sister Catherine finally looked up, her expression cold and disapproving. "Sister Margaret, I'm surprised to hear this from you. You've been here longer than anyone. You should understand the importance of discipline and sacrifice in religious life." "I do understand sacrifice," Sister Margaret replied, her voice stronger now, "but I also understand that God gave us different gifts for different reasons. When Sister Anna plays piano, I see her connecting with something divine. When the young novices learn simple songs, I see their faces light up with pure joy. Isn't joy also a gift from God?" Sister Catherine stood up from her desk, her posture rigid. "Joy that comes from showing off musical skills is not divine joy, Sister Margaret. It's worldly pride disguised as spirituality. I'm disappointed that someone of your experience cannot see the difference. But what if music could be used to teach and inspire rather than to show off?" Sister Margaret pressed on. "What if we could find a way to include music that brings us closer to God rather than further away?" "The discussion is closed," Sister Catherine said firmly. "The rules have been established for the spiritual good of our community. Your role is to set an example of obedience for the younger sisters, not to question the authority that God has placed over you." Sister Margaret felt the words hit her like a physical blow. She had spent nearly 70 years being obedient, sacrificing her own desires for what she believed was right. But watching the light go out of her sister's eyes was more painful than any personal sacrifice she had ever made. "I understand, Mother Superior," she said quietly, though her heart was breaking. "I will do as you ask." As she left the office, Sister Margaret felt older than her 86 years. The hallway seemed longer and darker than usual. When she passed the common room, she could see the piano sitting in the corner, its lid closed tight like a sealed tomb. She thought about Sister Anna, who had cried herself to sleep the night before. She thought about the young novices who had been so excited to learn music, now forced to find other ways to express their devotion. She thought about all the beautiful moments of community and worship that had been built around simple, heartfelt music. But most of all, she thought about the music that lived inside her own heart, the music she had buried so long ago, and that now felt more distant than ever. The piano keys that had once been so familiar to her touch would remain cold and silent, not just because of her own choice now, but because touching them was forbidden for everyone. The restriction was complete. 3 months had passed since Sister Catherine's strict rules had silenced the music in their convent. The halls that once echoed with gentle melodies and occasional laughter now carried only the sound of footsteps and whispered prayers. Sister Margaret had tried to accept the changes, but watching her fellow sisters struggle with the loss of their musical joy left a constant ache in her heart. It was on a cold Tuesday morning in November when everything changed again. Sister Margaret was sweeping the front steps when she heard the sound of car doors slamming. She looked up to see a social worker stepping out of a government vehicle, followed by a small figure that made her heart clench with immediate concern. The child was tiny, probably no more than 8 years old, with dark hair that hung limply around her face. She clutched a small, battered suitcase in one hand and what looked like a stuffed rabbit in the other. But what struck Sister Margaret most was the emptiness in the little girl's eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much sadness for such a young age. The social worker, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, was speaking quietly with Sister Catherine at the front door. Sister Margaret could catch pieces of their conversation as she pretended to continue her sweeping. "Car accident 3 weeks ago," the social worker was saying. "Both parents died instantly. She hasn't spoken a word since it happened. The relatives can't take her right now, and she needs somewhere safe while we sort out the legal arrangements." Sister Margaret's heart broke for this child. She had seen grief before, but there was something particularly devastating about seeing it in someone so small and vulnerable. "Her name is Sophia," the social worker continued. "She's been staying in temporary foster care, but it's not working out. She won't eat properly, won't interact with anyone, and the doctors say she's in severe emotional shock. We were hoping that the peaceful environment here might help her heal." Sister Catherine's response was formal and distant. "We'll provide her with food, shelter, and basic care, of course. But please understand that we run a quiet community here. We don't have specialized programs for traumatized children." As the social worker drove away, Sister Margaret watched Sophia stand in the entrance hall, still clutching her suitcase and stuffed rabbit. The child looked lost and terrified, like a baby bird that had fallen from its nest. Sister Catherine gave Sophia a brief tour of the orphanage section of the convent, showing her the small bedroom she would share with 2 other children, the dining hall, and the basic classroom where they provided simple education. But Sophia didn't respond to anything. She didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't even seem to really see what was being shown to her. She simply followed along like a sleepwalker, her small footsteps barely making any sound on the wooden floors. Over the next few days, Sister Margaret found herself drawn to this mysterious little girl. During meals, she would watch Sophia sit at the children's table, staring at her food without eating more than a few bites. The other children tried to include her in their games and conversations, but Sophia remained locked in her own world of silence and sorrow. Sister Margaret began volunteering to help with the orphaned children more often, something she hadn't done much in recent years. She would sit near Sophia during study time, not pressuring her to participate, just being a gentle presence nearby. She would make sure Sophia had warm blankets at night and would leave small treats by her bedside: a piece of fruit, a cookie, a flower from the garden. But nothing seemed to reach the child. Sophia went through the motions of daily life like a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit. One afternoon, while Sister Margaret was organizing supplies in the children's area, she overheard 2 of the other nuns talking about Sophia's background. The social worker had left more detailed information about the child's life before the tragedy. She was apparently quite musical, Sister Anna was saying softly to Sister Mary. Her mother was a piano teacher, and Sophia had been taking lessons since she was 5 years old. The social worker said music was a huge part of their family life. Sister Margaret's hands stopped moving through the supply boxes. Music. Of course. They had a piano in their home, Sister Anna continued. Sophia would practice every day after school. Her mother said she had real talent, that she could play pieces that most children her age couldn't even attempt. Sister Margaret felt something stirred deep in her chest, a mixture of recognition and pain. She knew what it felt like to lose music, but she had been an adult when she made that choice. Sophia was just a child who had lost not only her parents, but also the musical world that had connected her to them. That evening, Sister Margaret made a point of observing Sophia more carefully. During the children's free time, she noticed something that made her heart ache. Sophia had wandered into the common room where the old piano sat silent and unused under Sister Catherine's strict rules. The little girl approached the instrument, slowly, almost cautiously, like she was approaching something sacred. Sophia stood in front of the piano for a long time, just staring at it. Then, so quietly that Sister Margaret almost missed it, Sophia reached out one small finger and gently touched the fallboard that covered the keys. She didn't try to lift it. Even at 8 years old, she seemed to understand that the piano was off limits. But she stood there touching the wood, and for the first time since arriving at the convent, tears began to roll down her cheeks. Sister Margaret had to step back into the hallway to compose herself. The sight of this grieving child reaching for the music that might heal her, only to be blocked by rules that seemed suddenly meaningless, was almost more than she could bear. Over the following weeks, Sophia's behavior became a source of growing concern for everyone at the convent. She was losing weight, barely sleeping, and showing no signs of improvement. The doctor who came to check on her was worried about her complete withdrawal from the world around her. But Sister Margaret noticed something else. Every day, during the children's free time, Sophia would find her way to the common room and stand by the piano. She would touch the fallboard, run her small hands along the wooden sides of the instrument, and sometimes even kneel down to look at the pedals underneath. It was the only time Sophia showed any real interest in anything. One day, Sister Margaret found Sophia sitting on the piano bench, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the covered keys. The child looked so small and lost sitting there, like she was waiting for someone who would never come. "Do you miss playing?" Sister Margaret asked gently, sitting down beside Sophia on the bench. For a moment, Sophia didn't respond. Then, barely above a whisper, she spoke her first words since arriving at the convent. "Mama used to sit here with me." Sister Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "What did you and your mama like to play together?" Sophia was quiet for so long that Sister Margaret thought she might not answer. Then, in that same tiny voice, she said, "She taught me Für Elise. She said it was the first real piece she learned when she was little like me. We were going to play it as a duet for my school concert. The school concert that would never happen. The duet that would never be played. The mother who would never sit beside her daughter at a piano bench again." Sister Margaret looked at this broken child, and then at the piano that could potentially help heal her. She thought about Sister Catherine's rules about music being worldly and prideful. But what could be prideful about a grieving 8-year-old girl trying to reconnect with memories of her mother? That night, Sister Margaret couldn't sleep. She walked the halls of the convent as she often did when her mind was troubled, and her steps led her inevitably to the common room. In the moonlight streaming through the windows, she could see the piano sitting in its corner, silent and patient. She thought about Sophia, alone in her small bed, probably staring at the ceiling and remembering the music that used to fill her home. She thought about her own hands, which had once brought so much joy to others through music, now bound by rules that seemed to serve no one's spiritual good. For the first time in 67 years, Sister Margaret began to seriously question whether her sacrifice had been necessary. She had given up music to serve God, but what if God wanted her to use music to serve others? What if the gift she had buried so deeply was meant to be a tool for healing rather than a source of pride? As she stood there in the darkness, looking at the piano and thinking about Sophia's tear-stained face, Sister Margaret realized that some rules were meant to be broken when a human soul was at stake. The choice between blind obedience and compassionate action had never been clearer. Tomorrow, she decided, she would have to make the most difficult decision of her religious life. She would have to choose between the safety of following rules and the risk of following her heart. And for the first time in decades, her heart was speaking louder than her fear. Sunday afternoon arrived with a quiet that felt different from the usual peaceful silence of the convent. Sister Catherine had left early that morning to visit another parish 2 hours away, taking with her the stern atmosphere that had settled over their community like a heavy blanket. For the first time in months, the sisters could breathe a little easier, speak a little louder, and remember what it felt like to live without constantly watching over their shoulders. Sister Margaret spent the morning in prayer, but her thoughts kept drifting to Sophia. The little girl had been at the convent for 6 weeks now, and if anything, she seemed to be getting worse instead of better. She barely ate, rarely slept through the night, and had spoken only those few precious words about her mother and their piano duets. The doctor had visited again yesterday and expressed serious concern about Sophia's condition. "If we can't find a way to reach her soon," he had told Sister Catherine privately, though Sister Margaret had overheard, "we may need to consider more intensive treatment at a specialized facility." The thought of Sophia being taken away to some sterile hospital filled Sister Margaret with dread. This child needed love and understanding, not more isolation from the world. But how could they reach someone who had retreated so far into herself? After Lunch. Sister Margaret was walking through the main hallway when she heard something that made her stop in her tracks. It was the sound of crying, not the gentle weeping she sometimes heard from homesick children, but deep, heartbroken sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of someone's soul. She followed the sound to the common room and found Sophia, sitting on the floor in front of the piano, her small body shaking with grief. The little girl had her hands pressed flat against the wooden side of the instrument, and she was crying as if her heart was breaking all over again. "Oh, sweetheart," Sister Margaret whispered, rushing to Sophia's side and kneeling down beside her. "What's wrong? What happened?" Through her tears, Sophia managed to speak in broken words. I can't remember. I can't remember how Mama's hands looked when she played. I keep trying to remember, but it's getting fuzzy. What if I forget everything about her?" Sister Margaret felt her own eyes fill with tears. This was what grief looked like in a child. Not just sadness about loss, but terror about forgetting the person they had loved most in the world. "You won't forget your Mama," Sister Margaret said gently, pulling Sophia into her arms. "Love doesn't disappear even when our memories get a little blurry sometimes. But I can't hear her music anymore," Sophia sobbed. "In my head, I used to be able to hear her playing, but now it's just quiet. What if I never hear it again?" Sister Margaret held the crying child and looked at the piano that stood just a few feet away. Behind that closed fallboard were keys that could bring Sophia's mother's music back to life. Hidden in her own hands was the ability to help this grieving little girl reconnect with the most beautiful memories of her lost parent. The rules said the piano was forbidden, except for simple hymns during worship. The rule said that complex music was worldly and prideful. But what rule could be more important than helping a broken child heal? Sister Margaret made her decision in that moment, though her hands trembled as she reached for the fallboard of the piano. "Sophia," she said softly, "would you like to hear some music? Would you like me to try to play something your Mama might have played?" Sophia looked up with wide, hopeful eyes. She nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. Sister Margaret's heart pounded as she lifted the fallboard and revealed the keys she hadn't touched in 67 years. They looked exactly as she remembered them. Some slightly yellowed with age, a few with tiny chips and scratches, but still waiting patiently for someone to bring them to life. She sat down on the bench and Sophia climbed up beside her, just as she must have sat beside her mother so many times before. Sister Margaret raised her hands over the keys, and for a moment doubt flooded her mind. What if she had forgotten how to play? What if 70 years of silence had stolen her ability? What if her fingers no longer remembered the magic they once possessed? But then she thought about Sophia's tear-stained face and her desperate need to reconnect with her mother's memory. She thought about love being more important than rules, and healing being more important than perfect obedience. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Minute Waltz filled the air, and it was as if no time had passed at all. Her fingers found their way across the keyboard with the same grace and precision they had possessed decades ago. The muscle memory was still there, buried deep but not lost, waiting all these years for the right moment to resurface. Sophia gasped and grabbed Sister Margaret's arm. "That's it," she whispered excitedly. "That's one of the songs Mama played for me. How did you know?" Sister Margaret smiled through her own tears as her hands continued to dance across the keys. "Sometimes hearts recognize music that speaks to them," she said simply. As she played, something magical began to happen. Other sisters started appearing in the doorway of the common room, drawn by the beautiful music that hadn't been heard in their community for months. Sister Anna was the first to arrive, her eyes wide with amazement. Then Sister Mary, then Sister Helen, then more and more until the room began to fill with women who had been starving for the beauty that music could bring to their lives. Sister Margaret moved seamlessly from the Chopin Waltz into Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11, her fingers remembering every note, every nuance, every emotion that the composers had poured into their masterpieces. The old piano, slightly out of tune and showing its age, had never sounded more beautiful. "Play Für Elise." Sophia suddenly called out, her voice stronger and more animated than anyone had heard it since her arrival. "That was mine and Mama's special song." Sister Margaret's hands found the familiar opening notes of Beethoven's beloved piece, and Sophia began to hum along softly. For the first time in 6 weeks, the little girl was smiling. Not just a polite, forced smile, but a real expression of joy that lit up her entire face. As Sister Margaret played, she found herself lost in the music in a way she hadn't experienced since her youth. Each piece flowed naturally into the next. Debussy's Clair de Lune, Bach's Prelude in C major, Schumann's Traumerei. Her hands moved with a confidence and skill that seemed to surprise even herself. The room had filled completely now. Every sister in the convent had found her way to the common room, and they stood in respectful silence, some with tears streaming down their faces, all of them transfixed by the music that was transforming their sterile, rule-bound environment back into a place of beauty and wonder. Sister Anna was openly weeping, remembering her own lost joy in music. Sister Mary had closed her eyes and was swaying gently to the rhythm. Even some of the other orphaned children had crept into the room and were sitting quietly on the floor, their faces filled with the same amazement that Sophia was showing. When Sister Margaret began playing Clair de Lune, Sophia suddenly spoke up in a voice that was clear and strong. "My mama used to play that song when I had bad dreams. She said the moonlight and the music would chase away all the scary things." "Your mama was very wise," Sister Margaret replied, her hands never stopping their graceful movement across the keys. "Music has always had the power to heal and comfort." As the last notes of the Debussy piece faded away, the room remained perfectly silent for a long moment. It was the kind of silence that follows something truly beautiful, when people need time to absorb what they've just experienced. Then Sophia did something that brought tears to every eye in the room. She climbed onto Sister Margaret's lap, wrapped her small arms around the elderly nun's neck, and whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Thank you for bringing my mama back to me." Sister Margaret held the little girl close, feeling Sophia's heartbeat steady and strong against her chest for the first time since her arrival. The child who had been unreachable for 6 weeks was suddenly present and alive again, reconnected to the world through the universal language of music. But the magic wasn't over yet. As Sister Margaret continued to play softer, gentler pieces, Sophia began to talk. She told stories about her mother, about their piano lessons together, about the songs they had planned to perform. The words poured out of her as if a dam had finally broken, releasing weeks of trapped grief and allowing healing to begin. The other sisters listened in wonder, not just to the music, but to the sound of a child's voice returning to life. They had witnessed something extraordinary, the power of music to reach places that words and medicine and even prayer sometimes couldn't touch. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the common room, Sister Margaret realized that she had never felt closer to God than she did in that moment. Her hands on the piano keys, Sophia's warm weight in her lap, and the faces of her sisters glowing with joy and wonder around her. This felt like the most sacred service she had ever performed. The forbidden piano had become an instrument of healing. The worldly music had become a bridge between a grieving child and the memory of her beloved mother. And Sister Margaret had discovered that some gifts are too precious to remain buried, especially when they can bring light back into someone's darkest hour. What Sister Margaret didn't know was that someone in the room had been quietly recording the entire performance on her phone. Sister Teresa, one of the younger nuns, had pulled out her device not to show off or create drama, but because she felt that what she was witnessing was too beautiful and too important to be lost forever. She had watched Sophia transform from a silent, broken child into a laughing, talking little girl in the span of a single afternoon, and she knew that this moment needed to be preserved. At first, Sister Teresa just wanted to have the recording, for their own community, something they could listen to during difficult times to remember that miracles really do happen. But as she watched the video later that evening, seeing Sister Margaret's incredible skill and Sophia's joyful face, she felt a strong urge to share this story with the world. The next morning, while Sister Catherine was still away on her parish visit, Sister Teresa made a decision that would change everything. She uploaded the video to a local news station's website with a simple message: An elderly nun plays piano for the first time in 67 years to help a grieving child heal. Sometimes love is more powerful than rules. At first, nothing happened. The video sat on the news station's website with just a few dozen views. But then something magical began to occur that nobody could have predicted. A local news reporter named David Chen was browsing through submitted videos when he came across Sister Teresa's upload. He watched it once, then immediately watched it again. Then he called his editor and said, "You need to see this right now. This is something special." Within hours, the local news station had picked up the story. They sent a reporter to the convent to learn more about Sister Margaret and Sophia. The story they put together was simple, but powerful. An elderly nun who had given up music for God had broken a rule to help a traumatized child, and in doing so had reminded everyone about the healing power of love and music. The local news story was picked up by a regional station, then by a national network. Within 3 days, the video had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. People around the world were watching an 86-year-old nun play piano with the skill of a concert performer, while a little girl sat beside her, smiling. For the first time since losing her parents, Sister Margaret had no idea any of this was happening. She was focused entirely on Sophia, who had undergone an incredible transformation since that Sunday afternoon. The little girl was eating regularly, sleeping better, and most importantly, talking about her parents with love instead of just overwhelming sadness. Sophia had even started helping Sister Margaret in the garden, chattering away about her memories, while they tended to the flowers together. It was Sister Anna who first told Sister Margaret about the video going viral. "Sister," she said, barely able to contain her excitement, "you need to know what's happening. The whole world is watching you play piano. The video has been seen by millions of people." Sister Margaret was confused at first. "What video? I don't understand." Sister Anna explained about Sister Teresa's recording and how it had spread across the internet. Sister Margaret's first reaction was panic. What would Sister Catherine say when she returned? What would happen to their community? What about the rules? But then Sister Anna showed her some of the comments and messages that were pouring in from around the world. People were writing about how the video had brought them to tears, how it had reminded them of the power of music in their own lives, how seeing Sophia's transformation had given them hope during their own difficult times. One message came from a grandmother in Japan who wrote, "I stopped playing piano when my husband died 5 years ago. Watching Sister Margaret made me realize that music isn't about showing off, it's about healing and connecting with others. I'm going to start playing again." Another came from a music teacher in Brazil. "I've been teaching children for 20 years, but I had forgotten why I started. This video reminded me that music can literally save lives. Thank you for showing us what really matters." There were messages from parents whose children had stopped speaking after trauma, from elderly people who had given up their hobbies, from musicians who had lost their passion for playing. Sister Margaret's simple act of compassion had touched something deep in people all around the world. When Sister Catherine returned from her parish visit 2 days later, she was furious. The convent's phone was ringing constantly with interview requests. Reporters were gathering outside their gates, and their peaceful, private community had suddenly become the center of international attention. "This is exactly what I was trying to prevent," Sister Catherine said angrily during an emergency meeting with all the sisters. "Pride, attention-seeking, worldly distractions. Look what your disobedience has brought upon our community, Sister Margaret." But Sister Margaret surprised everyone, including herself, with her response. Instead of apologizing or hanging her head in shame as she might have done months earlier, she stood up straight and spoke with quiet confidence. "Mother Superior," she said, "I understand your concern about pride and worldly attention, but I want you to look at Sophia." Everyone turned to see the little girl, who was coloring quietly at a small table in the corner of the room. She looked up and smiled brightly at all the nuns, her eyes clear and alive in a way they hadn't been since her arrival. 6 weeks ago, that child was barely living, Sister Margaret continued. The doctors were talking about sending her away for intensive treatment. She wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping, wasn't speaking. Today, she helped me bake cookies for the other children, told me 3 stories about her parents, and asked if I could teach her to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star on the piano. The room was completely silent. Even Sister Catherine seemed to be listening carefully. If helping one broken child heal is prideful, then I am guilty of pride, Sister Margaret said. If using the gifts God gave me to bring comfort to others is worldly, then I choose to be worldly. And if breaking a rule to save a child's spirit is disobedient, then I will gladly accept whatever punishment you think I deserve. Sophia looked up from her coloring and walked over to Sister Margaret, taking her hand. Sister Margaret isn't bad, she said in her clear, strong voice. She saved me. She brought my mama's music back so I could remember her with happy feelings, instead of just sad ones. The other sisters began to murmur their agreement. Sister Anna spoke up. Mother Superior, we've all seen the change in Sophia. We've also seen how the music has brought joy back to our community. Maybe the rules need to serve love, not the other way around. Over the next few days, interview requests continued to pour in. Concert halls from around the world sent invitations for Sister Margaret to perform. Record companies offered contracts. Music schools wanted to give her honorary degrees. The attention was overwhelming and, honestly, a little frightening for someone who had lived such a quiet life. But Sister Margaret turned down all the offers to leave the convent. This is my home, she told the reporters who came to interview her. These are my sisters and these children need me here. I didn't play piano to become famous. I played to help a little girl heal. However, she did make one important change. With Sister Catherine's reluctant permission, Sister Margaret began giving piano lessons to Sophia and the other children at the convent. What started as simple scales and basic songs gradually grew into something beautiful. Sophia showed real talent, just as her mother had believed, and several of the other children discovered their own musical gifts. The old piano in the common room, which had sat silent for so many months, became the heart of their community once again. Evening gatherings featured gentle music and singing. Children's birthday parties included special piano performances, and sometimes when the day had been particularly difficult, Sister Margaret would play soft, comforting melodies that seemed to ease everyone's troubles. Sister Catherine never officially apologized for the music ban, but she did quietly remove it from the convent's rules. She began to understand that music, when used with the right intentions, could indeed be a form of prayer and a way to serve others. The video continued to circulate around the world, inspiring countless people to rediscover their own buried talents, or to use their gifts in service of others. Music schools reported increased enrollment. Nursing homes started piano programs for elderly residents. Churches began incorporating more music into their community outreach. But perhaps the most beautiful outcome was Sophia herself. 6 months after that life-changing Sunday afternoon, she performed Für Elise at the convent's Christmas celebration, the same piece her mother had been teaching her before the accident. As her small fingers moved confidently across the keys, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Sister Margaret, now 87 years old, watched from the front row with tears of joy streaming down her face. She had spent 70 years believing that she had given up music for God, only to discover that God had been waiting all along for her to use music to serve others. The piano keys that had remained cold and silent for so many decades were warm and alive again. Not because someone had changed the rules, but because someone had chosen love over fear, compassion over obedience, and healing over hollow tradition. And in that choice, both a broken child and a buried gift had found their way home.